Barb. I'm just glad you're here.
Thanks. I'll talk about that in a moment. Um, Looks like I've stopped sharing. Good evening, everybody. My name is Barb Halpin. I am the Commissioner's Staff Liaison to the Emergency Services Grant Program Advisory Committee, and it is February 24th, 2026. This is our first meeting of 2026, and it's typically the meeting where we recap what went well, maybe what needs to be improved from the fall grant round to the fire districts. And then we look ahead to launching the spring search and rescue and trail safety grants. So with that, we'll go ahead. I know everybody on the screen knows each other, so we won't go through introductions, but let me go ahead and share my screen one more time. Um, those who need a refresher on which positions that you hold. And again, for anybody in the audience, this is going to be recorded and posted to the website. You can see your names up there, and some of you are at large. The rest of you hold a specific position. And if any of those are incorrect, please let me know. So we just finished our third round of fire district grants, and some of you have been with us since the beginning. Others of you, this was your first or second trip through. And I think we've gotten to a place where these are pretty well tweaked at this point. However, um, the scoring for the fire districts has gotten pretty general. We look at, are they eligible? What's the overall quality of their proposal? Is it implementable, realistic, and sustainable? And that has kind of its own shovel-ready piece of it. We then look at the costs, equity and inclusion, and finally, what's your gut telling you about whether it should be funded and should it be fully funded, partially funded? And then after you do that scoring on your own for each of the grants, we then get together and you all discuss amongst yourself the merits of each application using these scoring totals as a cue. And is there anyone who feels like this is not complete enough or creates too much of a burden on you as you're going through and scoring? Now, we had 21 applications last fall, which was more than we'd gotten altogether in the last previous years. So there was a lot. And I have a feeling most fire district rounds are going to become like that. We are going to see funding requests from, I think there's 25, 24, I forget the total number of potential fire districts, but I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing most of them put in an application every year. We probably won't be entertaining grants proposals from the sheriff's office again. I've asked the sheriff's office to look at their budgeting in other ways. Um, that was one that took up a slot. So again, I feel pretty comfortable, but I'm not on the scoring side. So this is really a time for you to tell me, is there something that didn't really work for you?
I have a thought question, something to throw out there, and it's about the equity.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that, we've kind of tweaked with that a couple times, but we still get, we serve everybody, we're not gonna discriminate, when we go on a call or, and I think that's kind of given. I'm curious if we can add or tweak the wording to say something about I don't want to necessarily say what are your outreach efforts around, you know, making sure that people in your community feel included, like something.
Something it
Oh,
really gets to it. I'm trying to look for the questions we ask, and now you're talking about what we ask on the application
I agree,
versus
Lynette. That's what I was gonna bring up. Because we just don't get good answers on this. I almost want to say, do not say we serve everyone.
right.
yeah, and
I'll
maybe we
take
could put,
points from you.
I
maybe
thought
we
we
could put
did
that
say
in the
that.
question.
I think we did phrase it like that
We
and said,
did.
you know, yeah.
They just ignore it.
They just ignore. I mean, now, unfortunately, that is true. That you all went through a great deal of work to come up with the question, and um, we went through the, beyond your agency's commitment to serving all people during times of need, please describe how your agency works in times of non-emergencies to ensure that all voices in your community are included in the project planning and decision-making related to this grant request.
Great
Um,
question.
I thought it was a great question. I thought you did
It
an amazing
is.
job. And I'd say we got well, we got one really good response. But I do think that there is sort of this idea of a stock, and I can't see what I'm sharing with you, unfortunately. Yeah, that does look like what I want. So, again, happy and open to continuing to work on that.
Can we throw like a couple of examples? Like
Yes.
just tack in there somewhere, like for example, community pancake breakfast, or maybe that's not a good one, but just like participation in National Night Out, or like community outreach events, or I don't know.
Demographics of the communities you
Yeah,
serve,
do you know the
demographics of your fire
demographics?
department. Like, who do you
Yeah,
recruit?
and
I
maybe
mean,
just
maybe, yeah,
put that as like an example, to
like
kind
we
of
have to
give
spell it
them.
out.
Yeah, yeah.
I think that's a great idea, you guys. I think Maria would be very proud of the two of you for bringing that up.
Exactly.
But I think the question is worded so well, and you're right. It's just they're overlooking it, and the only thing you can do is lead by example. So, or enforce the fact that when they don't answer the question well, there are repercussions in the scoring, as opposed to just giving them a pass every time.
And I think we did. I think part of our scoring did take that into consideration if people weren't answering that question properly. Or at
I
least
do
I
think
did.
this,
Still funded most people. We still funded most organizations, and they all got something anyway, so they wouldn't really know that. You know what
Good
I'm
Right.
point, Jody, because they did talk around it. Like some used a lot of words
saying?
to
Right.
talk around it. And when you deal with the government and presentations, you're like, okay, I know what you're doing.
so I do think that, we could do some prompting ahead of time and really draw attention to this question more, perhaps, than before. And maybe there is some sort, and again, you don't really have to. I'm going to put all these notes in for when we come back and visit this before the next fall grant round, because you'll get another chance to look at the application questions. Um, and, you could consider some sort of penalty is the wrong word, but, um, discount on not at least them saying what they're going to do in their communities for, um, now we are, I've gotten some feedback from the attorneys that we need to tread carefully on this. That this was a ballot issue written as it was written and as it was passed by the voters. So there's more carrot, less stick, I think is going to be the better route. But at the same time, we can certainly say, look, we really want you to use this money in addition to, what your direct needs are, to getting out in front of your community and having touch points before you're in an emergency or crisis situation. So you were
Barb,
gonna say something, Cynthia.
I
Go
don't
ahead.
remember the exact wording, but this is a Boulder County criterion. right? I mean, this is something that Boulder County has established. So whether they like to jump through equity hoops or not, this is a requirement of them qualifying for the grant. And I don't know, I don't remember if the language stipulates that so clearly, but we might want to lay it out of like, this is a Boulder County criteria that is essential to address, or something like that. You know, you can speak to examples of your demographic makeup, or the demographic makeup of your community, or outreach events you've done, or things like
Mhm.
that.
Yeah, I'm just gonna say, in the climate we're dealing in presently, we've had to really
Dial it back.
dial it back. And for reasons I don't really wish to go into right now on this call. So that is ultimately where we were heading. And certainly that would follow the county's agenda. I think, and check back in 6 months, things could be very different. This is a moving target. And so I think for now, I'm going to put down notes about helping with examples, again, saying, hint, hint, this is what we mean when we say, what's your organization doing? And then maybe in August, we will have a different climate and we can go back to where we were, I think, a year ago, or a little just before a year ago, which said, this is the county's policy, 9.02, how did your organization, align with that? So we've kind of started, and again, I know Maria, if she were here, probably not be happy that I'm asking you to sort of not to push too hard on the apple cart right now, but we will, before the next grant round, we will visit this, at least for the next fire districts. Go ahead, Rick.
I had a question. It seemed that there was some reaction to some of the entities that applied in this last round and the scope of some of these requests. In that, City of Boulder, City of Lafayette, other large organizations with large budgets were asking for large sums of money. And the question, I was at first taken aback by it, realizing, of course, they are in Boulder County, but that I'm not sure what I'm asking. I'm just saying it seemed as if the nature of who was applying had changed.
Let me address that real quickly because I think that's a very important question. I do think this committee did a great job at taking something that was challenging, taking several things that were challenging, but one of them was we had a couple of cities apply. We've had that over the past couple rounds. And I think what this committee did so well was pull it out and really look at it as to where that money was going to be spent and where it was going to be used. And there was quite a bit of discussion around that. There's nothing that from the ballot language that prevents a municipality or a well-funded organization to ask for money. And I do think it falls on this committee to, even if it means going back and getting a little more information, to really fine tune who it's going to benefit.
Right. One of the a couple of the organizations said, "Hey, this is a unforeseen shortfall. We just need to make it up this one time." Do you think that when the grants were issued, that was stated clearly enough that this wasn't meant to be an ongoing funding source for budgeting issues?
I don't know that that's 100% true, because part of what really prompted the half of the tax that goes either to the grants or the other ongoing services was originally this started off as half the tax for the search and rescue building. And as the commissioners and other stakeholders and actually the proposers of the ballot issue started to work through that year, and we had the Marshall Fire part of that. It was determined that there are funding shortfalls with the districts. They're doing the best they can, and those of you who work for the mountain districts know, you're repairing old engines and you're using peanut butter and glue on things. You're doing the best you can, but it was kind of created out of the idea that there isn't enough money always in everybody's budget. So having a shortfall, so trying to meet a need is actually one of the purposes. I don't think that that's true though for an organization like a city or the county that can fund can plan ahead. And that's something, again, the committee had to be really due diligent about determining whether they were going to say, yes, this one time it's allowed, but we're putting a hard no on your coming back a year from now. That's why each grant round's a little bit different or unique. And we keep notes, and you guys have good memories. And I do believe when you said, we'll pay this year, but we won't pay it again, you're going to remember that and hold true to that. So it's open enough that it allows for these kind of gray area applications to come in. And that's why your jobs are so important, because it takes that extra, just digging it in and looking closely at things. And you were very fair in that there were a couple grants that got cut back and didn't get fully funded. They didn't meet sort of the overall general sense of how much money can be requested, even though there's no exact amount. Every grant round kind of finds its equilibrium, I think, in terms of a balance. But you do that. That doesn't just happen. So I think we almost have to continue, unless there's a blatant abuse that we continue to see happening, and we can, kind of cut that off before we put it out. I think that some of these things are just going to be squishy until a new precedent is set. Does that make sense, Rick? I know you're kind of helping me just preach to the bigger choir out there.
It does. I just want, large organizations, the sheriff's office, the, city of Lafayette, the Boulder Communications, it'd be nice if this wasn't the place they went for their funding.
So noted. And I have the backing of the
City of
Office
Boulder,
Finance. Yes. Ben, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, just to piggyback off of Rick's comment and thinking about how this relates to the upcoming round. Last year, we had big asks from BES and RMR groups. I think BES specifically had kind of been outed by the sheriff's office. A lot of their budget is normally covered by the sheriff's office. And last year, I forget the exact dollar amount, but they came to us asking for hundreds of thousands of dollars, a factor of 10 greater than our average ask from other groups, saying, hey, we need this money to continue providing the critical services that we do in Boulder County. But the sheriff's office isn't picking up our tab anymore, so they're coming to us. Similarly, RMR was asking us for some funding as well. So those are groups that should be funded and are essential services for the county. And I don't think that we need to necessarily come up with an answer right now for this, but just thinking about how Rick's comments relate to what we're going to see in this upcoming round. Will we see more groups looking for big operational budgets, groups like BES asking for major infrastructure and building requests, and how are we going to think about those and handle those for this round?
And thank you, Ben. We will get into that. I was trying to kind of isolate our past round
Okay,
first, just because they are different, and we have different challenges with each round. But I did do make that note, and I'd like if we could just pause and address
Can
it
table that. Yep,
when we
thank you.
get to the spring, because we're gonna have to dig into that. Yeah, I know the other thing, and Harry, I don't mean to out you on this, but there was some question as to whether we should set aside 20% or something of the budget in the fall, and then for a certain you know, well used, everybody needs them kind of supplies and equipment. I have kind of chopped that idea around. There is concern about sort of the wrinkle of complexity around that, and essentially somebody has to be the warehouse keeper and the giver outer. You know, maybe the best way, if the committee wants to go in that direction for next fall, would be to ask BCFA to well in advance start getting some, you know, orders in, or some you know, how many people are going to need the oxygen tanks, how many are going to need things. But I do know that the districts themselves, one of the things that is so important is being able to ask for the specialized equipment that they need at that time. And I'm not sure, there's going to be some relative what do you call it, of scale, basis is, what's the, whatever the wording is, you know, if you buy more at once,
Economy of
quantity,
scale.
the economy of scale, thank you. However, somebody's going to have to hold on to all that that's ordered. Somebody's going to have to figure out, it's like Girl Scout cookies, you know, how many districts want the lemon ones versus the Samoas versus whatever else the choices are out there. And that piece may not actually lead to a cost savings. It may lead to, you know, because the BCFFA is a nonprofit, they don't have staff, they don't have people that can run around and do all that and everything. The county certainly does not want to become a clearinghouse for equipment. So unless there's sort of a proposal that this group wants to come up with and present and really look at for the next fall, I think we probably may need to just stick with individual districts asking for what they need, unless there's an overarching need, like the radios that were first purchased. The other thing is, and Lynette, I think when you said it's good to see me, it was that my position with the commissioners, it was a term position, it's ending at the end of June. And there's still not yet a good answer for who's going to take over this grant program. BCFFA was initially interested in doing it, become basically being the go-between between the county commissioners, the group of your group, the committee, and the districts. That's decided that that's not the way the county feels would be fair. That there really needs to be sort of not a disinterested third party, but that the county itself, as the keeper of the funds, still be the one to work with this committee to come up with the recommendations. So there is no replacement right now, but hopefully as we get through the spring grants, I'll have more information along those lines. And there is a proposal that maybe the next fall round just gets split in some way with all the fire districts. It still needs somebody to administer it. It still needs some level of discernment as to how that amount, you know, if you just want to split it evenly, that means that, you know, there's concerns in any way right now in how the money is split up, whether it's by population of the district or number of calls, or, you know, all of that is going to need some more input and thought. But one of the things that's one of the solutions that has been raised. So I don't want you to put too much right now into building out next fall's program until we know what it's going to look like from an administrative position. I am committed to getting through the spring round, and I think that we should proceed with no changes other than ones that you deem are valuable to do to change for this round, but nothing major is going to change in between now and May. So maybe other than the equity question, I'm still trying to get people to do the like quick summary proposal. I've tried different ways of asking for that on the application, and some do a good job, some don't. I mean, it's grant writing is not a skill that even I have, and yet we're asking fire districts to put a lot of information together, and some have the benefit of being able to hire a professional and help them, and others are doing this in between calls. So I got to give some grace to everybody who applies. But unless there's anything sort of major takeaways from either your experience scoring or the discussions afterwards, that's kind of what I wanted to take notes on tonight before we get into the spring round. And I know it's been a few months, things quickly leak out. And you're always welcome to send me anything if something comes up later.
Barbara, I
So-
think, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that where we ended up, other than what we've already discussed, is good for me. I felt like it got at the content that I needed in order to make an informed decision. And I will say that the addition of the one question around the duplicacy of services and the shared equipment was probably the most helpful to me, being one of the newer members in this. So,
Do you want to expand on that a little, Jody, in terms of how it was helpful?
well,
I
it
mean-
was, yeah, it was just helpful from the standpoint of not understanding maybe some of the politics of which department can help which area can help which association can help which, and then understanding who are the keepers of some of the larger equipment pieces, right? Whether those are the drones or whatever that might be, and where they are willing to share and where they do share and help one another, and where it seems like a very siloed situation. That really helps being able to assess when a particular association asks for a piece of equipment, if it's something that they just don't want to borrow, or they really are, high and dry and need that piece of equipment to support their area. So that was a very
Great.
helpful question to me. That was probably the best addition that we had, in my opinion.
Thanks for sharing that. And I know that having three, we actually had 3 review sessions last time when normally you have 2. You all had to go into those deeper conversations to get that grant round done. So that's good to know. Anybody else before we jump off last fall? And if there are, I mean, I'm always, again, I'll pass on any ideas for economies of scale, or I know that originally the county really did want to see more collaboration, less, fewer silos. We keep talking about there will be a day when every district already has basically what they need, and then they can focus on collaboration. But I don't know. I think that might need to be an effort that is a year-long effort to get them there in advance. All right. Well, first let's just quickly jump over to the timeline. And if you can tell me, this was sent out last Thursday, if in general you're okay with, and if we can come to some decisions tonight, like I hope we can, I can probably launch the spring round even a week earlier, or at least by the 5th of March. So, the idea is to launch the program somewhere in here, about the same time we launched it last year. Curiously enough, I look back and I think we launched it on the 6th of March last year, so that would be in line with doing that. We don't need to meet in March because the application will be open, and the deadline we're looking at is the deadline similar to taxes, the night before perhaps. And then giving you all about a week and a half to score. I don't think we'll see as many applications as we just did in the fall. I think we've gotten 8 to, forgot the first round. I know that the first round we only funded about half of what we received, but I don't think we'll see as many applications this spring. I'd say probably 8 to 10 is going to be normal. Then we'll hold the normal meeting the 4th Tuesday in April, and at some point we'll do a doodle poll, figure out another date if we need it, and then your recommendations I'll take to the Board of County Commissioners somewhere the week before Memorial Day. That's sort of my. Does anybody have any large disruptive plans that don't meet these dates?
I'm in school. So that started I'm in a program for disabled veterans. So I'm going back to school to work on a degree, and maybe I'll be a doctor in physical therapy eventually if I can make it through all the math. So that's sort of a 5-year thing. So these dates are going to fall right there when I'm in finals, but it's fine. It's cool. I can make space and work around other people's schedules now that I have a working laptop and I don't have to go to a library, a public library, to try to do my homework.
Yeah, I mean, school teams to me, I think Maria's also getting a doctorate. Ben, I think, did you complete your doctorate?
I did somehow.
You good for you. I feel like there's nothing more all comprehensive than being in school. It's like nothing ever. Lynette, you're shaking your head. Did you? I think you've taken certifications and all. Yeah, I'm
Except
very.
parenting. Parenting is a little bit probably
Yeah,
more hands-on, I've heard. But
I don't
school
know.
is students. I mean, you
The
got to give it to them.
Yeah, I mean, I still wake up in those panic dreams of having not turned in my paper on time, and they're more real than any other dreams I have. So- But aside from that, Rick, you don't have any month-long vacations that will keep you from these dates?
I do have quite a bit of travel planned, but nothing that interferes with the schedule.
Okay, thank you again for planning around us. Um, okay, do I hear anyone who cannot make these dates work in some way, shape, or form? Okay, great. Thank you for that. So we will proceed. Oh, come on, sharing screen. So now we'll jump into spring round. And Ben, I think you hit the nail on the head when you talked about, I don't think we're going to see anything different this time in terms of, I don't, I mean, I would hope by this point, some of those major capital improvements that BES has gotten come to us twice for, have been addressed. But I know that they also have the grant writer on retainer, and we should expect sort of another list of items from BES. And RMR. RMR is building, by the way, and I haven't gotten the most recent update, but it is supposed to open at the end of, well, the end of this year, but I don't think that's possible. The tax that includes money for the RMR building goes through 2027. I'll get you an update on that, but it was, I think, supposed to be constructed this year. But I wouldn't be surprised if it's not going to be 2027 before that's open. But that is coming online, and that's going to not only give RMR a building to run their operations out of, but it's going to have a room that's dedicated to helping nonprofits do their training, do first aid training, do avalanche training, do all kinds of things that will be a collective space for that. So as we look ahead to the requests that we're going to see, maybe a little premature for this round, but certainly for the spring after this, we're going to try to see how that building can be utilized more by trail safety groups in particular. So in terms of the funding, I don't know. So yes, I do think we will continue to see BES and RMR put in requests. I don't know that I've received any, I'm going to say I haven't received any advice that we should not entertain those, that it's not, they're not inappropriate requests, but they should be balanced just like everything else with what other requests we receive. And I think the struggle for the spring is going to be, you know, who have we not reached? Who doesn't know about this grant program? And I realize my screen just changed. What can we do essentially to see that there's a bigger pool of eligible organizations who at least are aware of what we offer? And again, let's see here. So the good news about this round is that you did your work a year ago when we did the hot wash after the spring. You gave me your thoughts and ideas, which have been added in. So you don't have to do this from, oh, I'm trying to remember, you know, from 9 months ago. You actually tightened up some of these questions. And the same is true of the scoring. So nice thing is when I pulled this out, I had a nice list of the things you recommended we do differently for this round. So we probably don't have to do a whole lot of work on these. But having said that, this is always an interesting round. The fire districts are known entities. There's a finite number of them. We know a lot about them. You know, the search and rescue grant is much wider open. But we have this committee really has to look at what makes sense, what we really think is going to make a difference out there in the community with this money. And a couple of places that you tightened it up was the notion of shovel ready. That was a really good change about, you know, and I think you did that in preparation for last year's round, but it helped with the idea of people just having sort of like neat ideas that were not ready to be implemented, and that there were too many hoops that would have had to be jumped through and potentially not capable of jumping through them to get there. There's a little bit more discernment around what makes a really high value program. So this one, there's more scoring questions. Sorry, I was on the scoring part, but the application also has more questions. One of the things I want to ask you is, this was a bonus question for the fire districts, and I've put it in here for the search and rescue just to see if we want to make this a bonus question. Do we want to make this an actual question they have to answer? You know, this was our putting our toe in the water with the fire districts. Yeah, Cynthia, do you have a
Ben, do you have experience with these organizations, like in terms of their ability to collaborate? Because I think it's a beautiful idea, but as we've seen with the fire department, it's the map is not the territory.
Um, I think the ones that work for the sheriff's office and have MOUs are a little bit siloed. RMR, BES come to mind. I think some of the other groups, we did see some collaboration last year. Like I think Boulder Mountain Bike Alliance and the Ski Patrol said they were going to do some trainings together. Um, there's Indian Peaks Wilderness Alliance, and they partner with the Ski Patrol as well. So I think we do see a little bit, and I think that those groups did make an effort to reference their joint training. I'm biased because I'm just part of that ski patrol, but like I taught avalanche classes to members of IPWA last year and things like that. So they're making some effort.
That's awesome. I've
Great.
done trail work with IPWA and Wildlands Restoration Volunteers, and I'm surprised they haven't come for grant requests from us.
Mhm, mhm.
And Ben, just to get back to your initial question about the funding, I checked in with the sheriff's office. They said they have not decreased the amount of funding that is going to the MOU agencies. So which was good news because I, like you, had thought that that had been cut back and that therefore the grant program was being used to fill that in. I don't know what the prognosis is going forward, whether there's going to be a COLA type increase every year. It's been the same amount for many years, and I'm sure those agencies could use more money, especially with the cost of things going up. And I think that's a discussion the sheriff's office needs to have with those six, I think it's six agencies that have the MOU. But the good news was they were not cutting back that funding and telling those groups to get more funding from this grant program. It truly is meant to be supplemental to what they'd already received. But as with the fire, with the fire district, there was actually a couple applications we didn't get because I had conversations ahead of time because with the groups, it didn't really seem an appropriate eligibility. But FEMA has dramatically cut their funding. And that means that most of the state funding for emergency type funding has been cut drastically. So there's more groups that are going to be looking for funding overall. And some may apply and not be eligible, but when your main source of usual funding dries up, it makes grant programs like ours and attractive. So I do think that we need to address, I don't know that we can address too much in ahead of time in terms of saying those 6 MOU agencies should be limited in what they come forward with. I do think we need to address what they ask for, just like we've done in the past. And if we had a bigger pool, the last pool was really the first where we had fewer resources than requests. We've been in the situation before where we've gotten that the committee's determination hasn't really been limited by the funding available. That was not true for the fire districts. You had more money requested than we had money in the budget. We also don't have a set budget for the spring. There's 2.5 million for the year split between the two rounds. If we roughly follow what we did last year, 500,000 goes to the search and rescue, 2 million goes to the fire districts. But if we got amazing proposals in the spring that add up to 800,000 up to $1 million, and the committee really says these need to be funded, that is also a flexibility you have some play with. So I'm hearing kind of leave this as a bonus question, include it, but not give it extra merit to those that are collaborating, but maybe see if there is some efforts. I'd love to see a joint application come in,
I think it's good. I think it educates them a little bit. It's not required. It's a little bit extra. So it might be an opportunity for organizations to think collaboratively, whether or not we see those applications come forth. But I think the way that it's worded, bonus, optional, I think it lets them know like you could get a few extra points here if you want to, but You know, it's not going to prohibit you if this is not a collaborative project, but I think it helps to just frame that out for organizations to say, you know, this is a nice thing if you can do it.
Is there general consensus on that idea? I'm seeing some noddings of heads. Great. Okay. Sounds good. Well, again, your pre-work, I think, did a lot to get this in a good spot. Going over again to your scoring questions, there is a little bit more of a burden. There's 6 questions on the fire district side. There is 8 on, and part of this is that, again, it's just a little harder to get at some of these organizations that we don't know. And we don't have a great way, like the range of experience and knowledge on this committee often, is really robust and can help fill in. On the well-known search and rescue groups, the fire districts, but then we're going to get these nonprofit organizations that we may not be as familiar with. So I do like to do a little more scrutiny in how you evaluate those, if that makes sense. But if anybody thinks this is too long a list, feel free to push back on me on that. Some of these are a little redundant. There's the appropriate and relevant costs, and then, does we dig more into the organization's ability to carry out the activity than we do with the fire districts. I think we give a wide berth to the fire districts to know that they can utilize what they're asking for without us questioning too deeply on that. I think we found, and we've only done 2 rounds of the spring grants. I think we found the first round and a little bit on the second. We just need to have some level of confidence that these groups can do what they say they're going to do. They have the resources, they have the volunteers, they have whatever is needed to carry out what they're asking for. Does that seem reasonable to you?
I think it does. I mean, I remember last time we had some folks that wanted to do stuff up at Gold Hill because, they're angry about the ATV people. So,
Right.
it's kind of like not personal agendas, but kind of personal agendas. And I think this is a great way to kind of like, even if somebody does come forward with that, it's like, oh, well, is this a needed, what's their plan? Personally feel that's a good metric to keep in there.
And I know we had the private business, we had the physical therapy group that wanted to do a bunch of work
It was a
on.
chiropractor, I believe. I promise if I become a physical therapist, I won't come back to this group asking for money to stand at the trail and educate people. I promise.
I know it was creative, but I think we determined that we really can't fund a for-profit business. And I wonder if we should be more explicit about that. Or if there is if there is a space for a for-profit business in this. The ballot language doesn't say it has to be a nonprofit or a local government or, but it sure hit some red flags in terms of the promotion of an individual business, even though it was a well thought out proposal. Certainly might be a good business model for them. But I don't know if there's something in the question going back to what they see and what they have to respond to. And I could get attorney. I know the attorneys were not in favor of that particular application we got. I don't know if they'll say a blanket no on for-profit, but I will certainly make a point to ask for that.
Does it also have anything to do with liability? Like I could see if somebody's
Hmm.
out there and they tell somebody, hey, this is how you should ride your bike, and then they go crash, people are, like, would they get sued? And then could that follow the chain? Um,
That's an interesting, like, is there a higher level ability of I mean, because I think everything has a little bit of liability. I mean, if the ski patrol is out there administering first aid, and no offense to you, Ben, but the other ski patrol, the one you don't work with, I mean, what
I
happens if
think,
they further break somebody's leg or something? I mean,
no, I think a lot of that is covered though, through like
Good
your
Sam.
employer and your
Yeah.
training and
got
everything,
it.
there's metrics and there are, you can't just, like for fires, there would always be somebody be like, oh, I have a red card in Nebraska. Can I? And it's like, no, we appreciate your help, your willingness to help, but we can't bring you in. And it's mostly because you don't know their training, you don't know who they are, blah, blah, blah. So I don't know if liability is an issue there. I think with that one, um, that felt a little like part of that to me. I do think I have two questions. One was, I remember the MOUs was kind of a big issue at some point with Commander Wilbur, and I don't remember, like, can people, they don't have to have an MOU, correct, to get
No.
money? Okay. Um, and I'm also thinking, and maybe not this round, but I could imagine at some point there's going to be a lot coming in for the Eldora purchase, because that's going to be
How's
different.
how
Because it's going to be funded through the town of Netherland. It's not going to be managed by
but are you saying that they would want money for like
possible ski patrol or training or who knows?
interesting.
Who knows? I'm just curious.
Yeah. So interesting that is a private, oh, so it's town of Netherland. Huh, you're right. Because I've always thought of it as on private lands, which we don't really cover.
Yeah, the organization that was going to partner with them are no longer.
Correct. Yeah, and it's really a lease on Forest Service land.
Right,
And
right.
so I mean the whole thing well, it is its own ball of worms, but yeah, I'm just going to be really curious to see
Yeah,
how some of
good.
that might change, and it might
Mm-hmm.
not be till next year, but just be curious.
When is the ownership is supposed to actually transition over? We
I
don't
think
know.
they're still trying to find bonds. They're still looking for bonds and stuff.
Mm,
It's still, I think, in the no contact piece.
got it. Okay.
But I hear things, but
Right. Well, it's like, the city's Boulder's municipality program never actually came together after what, 15 years of, you know, them them pursuing it. So it'll be interesting to see if it actually does go through in the end. But good heads up on that. And
Lynette brings up a good point about immunity too, because governmental organizations have immunity built in that small businesses do not. So I don't know if that's I mean, I think that is a good question for the attorneys. Was there intent by the commissioners and or through the process of this ballot to serve nonprofit organizations who are underserved monetarily? Like, was that some of this point? Like that seems to be what they were trying to get at with the rural fire departments, is that they knew that they were underfunded, understaffed, underserved, under equipmented, and using peanut butter and duct tape to keep it together.
right.
So like,
That's a good
um,
point. I don't think the focus was nearly the same on on the nonprofit organization side
okay.
of the spring grant round. It was more about what can we do to make trails safer? And I do know that we're still really trying to get at um, that piece. I mean, the search and rescue groups, we know who they are. We know what they do. They actually do get called out by our dispatch center, and we know what we expect of them. Um, but are there groups that really could be contributing something in addition to that we either aren't aware of or don't? And how do we find them and how do we get, I mean, we have such a large area to cover. If you look at public lands in Boulder County, let me turn this off for a second.
Somebody
Rick.
let the out-of-state tourists know that they should not just show up and climb longs in a t-shirt without bringing water. I see
Yeah,
those
I just
rescue
have to say, I am so
alerts.
glad the Flatirons are in the city and not the county. Rick,
Does someone keep track of these searches and rescues?
this someone, that's a really good point. There's no,
Ask Commander Wilbur about that, because I bet that they've got
okay.
their
Someone's
Stats.
got to know.
well,
Well, I
yeah,
know
and
they have
then
stats, but I don't know who like oversees them.
it might be, I don't know if it's emergency services,
Oh, right,
because they get paged out on all those as well, but I don't know.
right. I mean, generally, I think we're very happy with the fact that we've got these search and rescue groups in Boulder County. They do a phenomenal job. They're very busy. But that's a good question, Rick. I will look into, because I mean, I think that I'm sure they all carry statistics on how many rescues they do, what kinds, what's the outcome.
And I'm pretty sure,
who
I
looks
think
at
even
that?
just like RMR and FERD are going to have their own information, and
Right.
I'm pretty sure RMR does for sure. I'm pretty sure FERD does as well, but just
And
like
FERD
how
is the front
many,
range rescue dogs, right?
yeah, just like how many calls they go out on, how many trainings they do, what their standards are. So they would probably have that information.
How
But
would this committee want to use that information, or would you, was there a basis to, or is there value in us asking for that up front, as part of the application process? Like, do they
I think it
have
might direct us to some organizations that are part of, may have MOUs or maybe part of search and rescue that we haven't been contacted by. It may give us, notify us of some groups that have been more active than we know.
yes. That would be a really good outcome. Okay, I'm going to add that in. I'm going to ask that they give us some level of
Demographic data.
demographic stat, yeah, and their
I think it's helpful to understand how critical their services are. Because obviously all these services are critical, but some will do, you know, 25 rescues in a year and some will do 70. So
yeah. We used to
I-
ask for like their annual report, but I think we shied away because not all of them would do it. But somebody's keeping records if they're worth their salt, I guess, and
if
they
they're
want to
applying for
continue.
grants, that's the meat
Yeah,
of a grant. So like
right.
one would think that they would be ready to proffer that pretty quickly. And I think if it's not too wordy and or complicated for them to prepare, give us an idea of the community that you serve. How many
That's
calls are
great.
you going out on? Those kind of things. I think that's just standard
And we can
information.
give them,
That's,
say, within 2 years or something, so that they don't have to feel like they've buttoned up 2025. They could give us 2024s, and
Yeah.
we would be happy with that. Excellent. Good idea. Okay. Yeah, because I do think because we've had the funding and because this was new and we were really trying to, test out some things, we were awarding groups with some funding. But really trying to figure out how effective that is. I mean, if a group goes to one or two trailheads, and that's it, I mean, there's hundreds of trailheads in Boulder County. So what's the overall benefit if there's not more coverage or some strategic reason that we should be funding a group to do something.
and if you're new, then obviously you're not going to have as much, time in the field, but
Yeah, so maybe
uh,
there's
but that gives us an idea of like how much traction do you have in your community to provide these services.
right.
How much are you interacting with your community? How much do they know about you? Because that's pretty important for them,
Right.
for
And
the
many of
community
these
to know.
organizations, they're recreation groups, they're not volunteer. I mean, they are volunteer, but they're interested parties going out and doing stuff they love. And, that's a bit different than their whole mission is to save and rescue people or create safer trails or whatever. I mean, that's what spring mix is a really interesting. There's just a lot of diversity amongst the kind of groups that apply, like helping somebody with first aid is a tertiary goal. I mean, really they're out there because they love to bike ride on trails and they want better trails and all that kind of thing. But then they're willing to stop and give aid if they encounter somebody, which is also really good. But that's not their major focus. Whereas RMR or BES, that's what they're asked to do, is go out on those calls.
And if you're building trails in Boulder County, people are already taking those trails while you're building it. They just walk
Yeah.
past you while you have all your equipment and they're like, oh, thanks for building the trail.
Yeah, we're having some difficulty with the social trails that were never supposed to be created in the first place, being
I believe it.
overused.
I've
Yeah.
re-vegged some of those places up at we built the boardwalk up at Mitchell Lake Trailhead Extension. I helped build a Mitchell Lake Trailhead Extension, the Long Lake Trailhead Extension, and then do work on Diamond Lake, which was geez,
Nice.
like civil what was that, Civil Corps program or something like that? You
Right.
might remember that, Rick, right? Diamond Lake was made by those folks back in like the 40s, and they hadn't done any trail work on it from that point. So we did a bunch of rehab on it. It's very burly work, but it was really fun. I did a lot of the like high altitude camp out stuff, and it was rough but fun.
That's true. You've got that element too.
And they
Yeah,
feed you.
that's good. It's always helpful. I wonder if there's a way we can tap into too, like areas that you just identified that were built a long time ago. They've become kind of worn or unsafe. Are there groups that want to go in? And we did have that one group that wanted to employ people. We didn't end up funding them. I had to kind of connect them with workforce, but the idea was offer that as a job, just like you would the youth corps in the summer. And the grant program didn't seem the right place to fund that because there's a whole coordinating component of it. But maybe, we haven't really seen those kinds of organizations either.
IPWA does trail work, and Wildlands Restoration Volunteers, and they're huge. And I don't know
Yeah.
what their funding situation looks like, because they have an office in Boulder. They're working all the way up into Fort Collins. They have a ton of different types of things like collecting seeds, or doing like rock work up in the high country, revegetation of really popular trails that are getting damaged. That's why we built that the boardwalk over the wetland there by Mitchell Lake Trail, which is it's got the beautiful view of the mountains. It's the money
I've
shot.
never been up there. It sounds like something I definitely
Oh
want
my
to check out.
God, is it gorgeous? You gotta go. And so it's really great work. They were, the Wildlands Restoration Volunteers, those were like 12-year planning projects or something with the Forest Service.
Yeah.
So by the time they finally got through all the approvals and everything, it had been a lot of years. So I don't know if they're such a big player that they wouldn't, and I haven't worked with them in a lot of years, but they were a great organization who did a lot of that stuff. They might be a good contact.
Yeah. Does anyone have
Rick,
an email? I mean, I can look it up, but does
I
anybody
can
have
I can reach out and just say, I used to do trail work with you guys. I'm working with a group and I'm just curious, like, are there some trails that are just raggedy? Because what I learned in trail work is the way that these trails were built a lot of times was just the easiest way to build them, which is exactly where the water flows, right along the trail. And so you don't build trails like that anymore. You're not going to build a trail through a basin. You have like outflows. You do little different designs and things like that to shed the water off, because you see those trails up in Boulder County where they're all waterlogged and snowy, and then they get super damaged, and then they just widen out as everyone's walking around the trail you can't take. So they don't get built that way anymore, but I guarantee there's a ton of trails that need work with respect to trail safety, replacing big timbers and that kind of stuff.
Annette, why don't you go ahead and jump in?
So I think I would, and I don't know how we could capture this or if there is a way to capture this, but I think like that group works as an intermediary and works with the agencies that actually own the land. So we would kind of run into some of the same issues like with that the cistern, right?
Yeah,
Like
I was
they
just
have
gonna
such a great
say,
idea.
it's the shovel ready
Um
issue there.
but
Yeah,
yeah, so we'd have to make sure, and I know that somebody had come up with some like signage issues, and it's like, well, each agency is very anal about their signage, and so I know that that agency or that organization works with individual agencies a lot, so it's going to end up being a land
yeah.
ownership issue. So I don't know. I mean, we could still reach out to them, but it's going to have to be a partnership, and it probably is something that has
It
to get.
sounds like a very difficult needle to thread, because especially if they're doing all the things like seed restoration and all, like
That's not
that's a
safety
hard
thing, but
exact. I mean,
yeah,
you could
yeah,
argue, but it sounds like there's also a lot of things they do that are great for restoration, but may have a hard time arguing whether they're really making trails safer. I don't know. I mean, again, that's why the spring round is just different and tougher in different ways, I think. Um, and maybe there has to be sort of an overall look again once we get through these, when there's no more to ask for by the two big agencies. um, is there a different way to structure the spring? Um, I think we thought we'd have a lot more interest and a lot more sort of the diversity, equity, inclusion piece, but again, signage, as you said, I mean, every organization has strict standards on what their signage looks like. And how can we break through if it's a barrier? How do we break through some of that? But that's asking a lot of a grant program.
Do you have contacts with like the rec department, Parks and Rec? Of like with respect to the trail, like are there trails that you guys have identified that are really unsafe that you're going to be working on, or
Well,
you know?
the county open space does a rigorous analysis, and they have the money in most cases.
Mm,
Yeah, to put
I'm
them on
starting
a
to hear
list.
again things. Yeah, they're starting.
Yeah,
Parks is actually starting to cut some programs and some funding, and it's just the county overall.
yeah,
But I think that if we'd like to kind of go this route and see if there are some partnerships to happen, which is what I kind of
yeah,
feel like these are, that all of these projects get planned out, especially with parks, just it's like 5 years out. It can
right,
be a long term out, and they usually use, the civilian court, although I think that's gone. But like the youth corps, they have seasonals that they bring in. However, this might be something that we could put out and then it again might not show up until next year. Where we'd say, hey,
right,
you know what, if you guys are interested in participating or helping support, like how could you partner with Boulder County Parks and Open Space? What can you do to work through any liability issues, insurance, waivers, all that stuff? And maybe help augment, and I'm guessing like Boulder Mountain Bike Alliance, they do a lot of trail work. Just some of
right,
those agencies already know how to do that. But maybe it's just offering that out there, even like as a pre, like, hey, we're going to be having these grants. Or you got, if this is your agency, or we can just reach out to those directly and say, hey, have you guys thought about partnering with a government agency? I'm pretty sure the Forest Service could really use some help right now, because they really are very underfunded, and a lot of those programs are just not being funded at all. So,
right. And
they
yet
probably,
they don't partnership well. I mean, they partner well. I mean, they have to get all kinds of
it
approvals from
takes so
DC. And
long. But
yeah,
yeah, so I mean, going that route, we could
and the
start.
cities have their trails, Longmont,
Mhm.
Boulder particularly, but also Lafayette, Louisville,
Mhm.
Erie.
Great
Um,
suggestion, Lynette.
yeah.
Because when you're building trails for, it's so different. I mean, you have hikers, you have equestrians, you have mountain bikers who are popping on their bike. And you have to make sure when you're making stone steps that they're not gonna, they're gonna live for 50 to 100 years, so that someone's not gonna take themselves out on their bike doing that. And you have to think about those kind of different pressure variants that are going to be different with the various groups, and then how can these different groups work together on the trail safely. There's a
Well,
lot
I
of
think
stuff
we
there.
almost have to be, it almost like they have to reserve the funding for 3 years out. Like they would
Mhm.
say, in 3 years, we're going to have a shortfall of $100,000 doing this. And so we want, it's almost like the spring route maybe have to be spreadsheeted out, for lack of a better word, but because I think it's rare that they're going to say right in this moment we know exactly how much money we're going to need and we can implement it this year. It's always over the many years. Rick?
Mhm.
Do you know if once the RMR building is paid for, if those funds are gonna be going into the general bucket for distribution or something else?
Um, so that part of the funding ends after
Oh, that part of the funding
2027.
ends. Okay,
The tax is a full 0.1% now. It goes down to a
got it.
0.05%.
Okay,
There's, it's likely there'll be some couple millions left over once the building is built, though. There's discussion as to how those funds will be used, but we won't have further collections of tax money after 2027. However, there are some private parties looking to try to get it on the ballot in 2027 to extend that extra half. So that could all change if the voters, if they get that action together and if the voters approve it, then, but then the whole ballot issue has to be rewritten to specify exactly what that money can be spent on. Right now, generally, we're saying capital. So once the building is built, I know the sheriff would like to see much more. The communications infrastructure built out in the mountains. Each time you improve an area like Allen's Park or Gold Hill or down in the plains, it's millions of dollars. I mean, it's so they've been able to chip away a little bit at it just using the county's budget, but in order to really make a strong communications network across the mountain areas in all the valleys and the peaks, you know, they're a good funding source could be used for that. The cisterns came up as maybe a capital, a well, just, where to place them, what land that they'd be built on is another. So there's lots of ideas for how to spend that capital money that might be left over. There's just no decisions on it. But it probably will not be put towards the grant program or the other internal services. Yeah, Cynthia?
You're an incredible resource, as is everyone on this board. I hope that if they do rewrite that ballot issue, that the commissioners ask this committee what we've seen to help, understand, like, what do we know from what we're seeing and how can we shape, because some of the questions we've had tonight kind of veer into that territory of, like, is this a legal question, or is this really, like, should the commissioners consider this question of equity, or
Yeah.
and so I think I
Well,
do hope they,
if any of you
consider.
is willing to be a subject expert on
Rick.
that, they would love to. Because, I mean, I do think that it was written as really as well as we could anticipate for something brand new, never tried before, anticipating all the kinds of things you expect, but you never know until you're into it what what the fallout or what things you're going to run into. So that you all have really been the closest to it, especially from the idea of what the needs are. All right, we're coming up on 7:30. I did only bill this for an hour and a half. Let me quickly look at my presentation. I think I've got enough to launch this spring, but if there's a big gaping hole I'm failing to recognize, please let's use the last 10 minutes or so to figure out how to make your lives better, easier in this next scoring round, and how to help agencies know really what we're looking for. And I can go back and look at this. So I've added in, some sort of accountability for, let me look here. Are you all seeing the proposed 2026? Okay. I've added in a part about getting a little bit more data up front about what services they do, who they serve, how often they're out there. Again, we're sticking with kind of something that's shovel ready, but as this program matures, we should probably look to something, maybe we don't fund spring grants on an annual. It's a, could be a 2 or 3 year larger project type thing. We're just going to ask them if they want to share something about collaboration with other organizations and what that might look like. And then the only other thing I wanted to cover with you all is that I think 3 of your positions are going to be up, and you'll have the option to reapply in July, August timeframe. I don't know offhand, but I think probably Rick. Now, Lynette, you were just reappointed. I think Rick, Ben, probably Doug, because I think you were the originals. Because Maria and Lynette were reapplied and were reappointed for 3-year warriors. Anything else that's sort of not sitting right with folks, or you feel like we're not quite to the point of being able to launch these grants? Okay, not seeing anything. Anybody need any additional refreshers before I send you out the scoring and that kind of thing? I guess you can tell me at the time. Okay. And yeah, well, again, thank you so much. I think this committee is just so committed to what you're doing, and it's so important. We'd have a really hard time determining which
I
grants
think we'd
get
have a
funded.
really hard time doing this without you. You are just amazing.
Oh, thanks.
You are
That's,
just the glue that holds it all together. So I'm not sure
that's
what
very sweet to
happens as we
hear.
move forward.
Sorry, my cat. I appreciate that. Thank you. This has been one of my favorite things ever to work on in my 20 years with the county. So I did not take the news, well.
Could
There's
we
been some,
petition them to not lose our Barb? Because I can be very vocal.
you're sweet.
And if we need to set aside some of the grant money, I mean, we can make that happen.
Yeah, I mean, that is one thing that's looked into, because it actually, my salary could be taken from, I mean, there is an administrative piece, not the grant money, but the other places in the tax. So there's some ideas afloat, but I don't know whether my time will run out before those ideas turn into something or not. So
Whatever we can do, Barb, just,
you're,
you
For
know,
sure.
let me
well,
know.
thanks.
Because
You,
you're an incredible resource. Your experience with the county, your experience working with emergency services, everything you've done. So I will fight them if they try to take you away from us. And I'm feisty.
thank you. I I believe that. And again, I really appreciate it. But I do want to make sure that this program is given put over in good hands, so that your work can continue to really shine. So with that, I guess we will say adieu for the evening, and reach out as always, and I'll be in communication as I get the application launched, and then of course when we get the applications in. But thanks for all your ideas tonight, and always.
Thanks, Barb.
All right, take care, everybody.
Bye,
Bye
everyone.
bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Barb. Bye, everyone.